Hello, I'm Jessica Olia from the Savage Quilter in Oklahoma City. April 12th, 2011 marks the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. On April 12, 1861, President Lincoln called for volunteers from men and women alike. Men enlisted in the military, and women served their purpose as nurses, spies, and some even disguised themselves as soldiers so they could fight side by side with the men they loved and cherished. Today we're going to review some books that contain Civil War quilts and patterns. Scraps of Life by Elizabeth Patton Crockett, wife of Alamo hero David Crockett. This book is a textile study of one quilt and the history behind this family heirloom. After Colonel Davy Crockett passes away, Elizabeth, his wife, is bereft with grief, and her daughter-in-law Rhoda comes to her and tells her that she thinks they should turn this scrap bag that she brings with her into a family heirloom quilt. And her entire life, Elizabeth has worked on the frontier to create this life for David, and she's had one hard work after another and never been able to create beauty, even though that's what she really desires. So together with her daughter-in-law Rhoda, they create this wonderful quilt. Each block is a trip around the world. Each round of the tiny squares is a different fabric. The fabric is repeated, and together, along with her daughter-in-law, they heal from Davy's passing. The Civil War Sewing Circle by Kathleen Tracy. This book chronicles the part that women played during the Civil War with the U.S. Christian Commission, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, and the sewing circles. This book contains quilt patterns such as the Union Stars quilt, a variety of dog quilts, and my personal favorite, the Soldier's Cot quilt. That quilt is long and narrow to fit on a soldier's cot, and it will fit on the current size of military cots. There's a Friendship Album quilt and pillow pincushions and a variety of other ones. Women formed sewing circles during this time, and they were really the first philanthropists. They had no money to give and no property to give. They had nothing to donate except their one thing of value, themselves. They gave their time to sew bandages, to sew uniforms, to make comforts, which were actually comforters, quilts that were tied, and quilts and other variety of items that soldiers needed. Coming Home by Joe Morton. This book includes 14 patterns, 12 which are new, 2 are worth repeating. This book has a variety of contributors. One of them is Jerry Camel Carr, which you may remember from Red Wagon. The patterns in this book use a mixture of squares and triangles, some applique blocks, and 2 of the patterns are basket patterns, which are exceptionally beautiful. One of the baskets uses diamonds, triangles, and squares with set-in seams. And a little more simple basket pattern uses triangles, squares, and rectangles with applique handles. A Path to the Civil War, Aurelia's Journey Quilt by Sarah Maxwell and Dolores Smith. Dolores Smith and Sarah Maxwell of Homestead Hearth found a mid-1800s antique sampler quilt. They could easily imagine the quilt maker Aurelia Bevins of Broome, New York. This quilt was undoubtedly pieced over a long period of time based upon the large number and varied number of fabrics included in this quilt. As these ladies sat down to draft each one of these blocks included in this quilt, Dolores and Sarah show you step-by-step methods using today's quilt making techniques on how to recreate this 44 block sampler treasure. Last but not least are my 2 favorite Civil War quilt books. The Civil War Love Letter Quilt and the Civil War Diary Quilt are both written by Rosemary Young. Both of the books contain 121 quilt blocks that are different, 6-inch size, and paper pieced. There are a few applique quilt blocks sprinkled liberally throughout both of the books. The Civil War diary quilt is really interesting because it is authentic diary entries from 10 different women. They range from a variety of teenage girls' perspective all the way up to a Confederate spy. These ladies are all different ages with different circumstances in different parts of the country. I found it very interesting to see how the Civil War affected each one of these ladies. The Civil War Love Letter Quilt is just a wonderful book because the entire thing is love letters from these men during the war out fighting away from their families, sent home to their loved ones. There's 121 different letters, a letter for each block. Bonnie Blue Quilts is a group of ladies that has dedicated themselves to creating patterns for 1800s reproduction quilts. This pattern is Carolina. I believe this is the most beautiful setting for a Carolina lily I have ever seen. Carolina lily happens to be one of my favorite patterns. The Carolina lily grows throughout the southeast from West Virginia to Florida. Carolina lily quilt pattern dates back to the early 1800s. Unlike the flower, which is yellow to reddish orange, most Carolina lily quilts from this period were in the popular colors of the time, red and green. Bonnie Blue Quilts, Plantation Road, 1800s reproduction quilts. When I was learning about the Civil War, I thought that all slavery was the same. This quilt is exceptionally interesting to me because this quilt is reproduced with the inspiration of Henry McAlpin's 400-acre Hermitage plantation north of Savannah, Georgia. Henry was revolutionary because he used the task system of labor. Unlike the gang system where slaves worked from sunup until sundown, the task system relied on dividing the work into specific tasks. Once the task was completed, the work for the day was done. The Hermitage plantation produced rice, manufactured bricks, rice barrels, cast iron products, and lumber. The slaves at Hermitage made bricks by hand, and by 1850 had produced over 60 million bricks used in buildings in and around Savannah. Their own quarters were made of bricks as well. When you see the close-up version of this quilt, it looks like little bricks. Bonnie Blue Quilts Madison, 1800s reproduction quilt. Madison, Georgia, established as the county seat of Morgan County in 1809, was named in honor of the United States President James Madison. One of the prominent citizens of this area, Joshua Hill, has been credited with saving Madison from Sherman's scorched earth campaign. Hill, a U.S. Senator, resigned his seat in 1861 rather than withdraw Georgia from the Union, as the other members of the Georgia delegation intended to do. The left wing of Sherman's march to the sea consisted of 2 Army Corps under Major General Henry Slocum. They threatened the city of Madison. Pro-Union sympathizer Joshua Hill was given permission to cross those federal lines and meet with General Sherman. During the meeting, Hill and Sherman reached an agreement to save Madison. Hill had met Sherman before in Atlanta when Hill traveled there to pick up the body of his son, Liger, who had lost his life in Cassaville. Only the railroad facilities, a depot, cloth factory, cotton gin, and 200 bales of cotton were burned. The stragglers who followed Sherman's army looted stores, and a communion service was stolen from the Presbyterian Church. But General Slocum ordered that it be returned. The business and residential areas of Madison were spared, thanks to all the hard work of Joshua Hill. Bonnie Blue Quilts, a quilt for Alice, historically inspired quilt. One of the many things that came out of the Civil War was the realization for women that they needed to be represented by their own ability to vote. The fight for women's right to vote began at the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and ended 72 years later with the ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920. Alice Paul, national chairman for the Women's Party, brought national attention to the women's suffrage movement. She and her supporters picketed the White House carrying banners using President Wilson's own words from a speech he recently gave on democracy. The police, feeling that the ladies were unpatriotic in a time of war, arrested Alice Paul and her fellow picketers. They charged them with obstructing traffic. Inside the jail, the women continued to protest. They staged a hunger strike, which resulted in the officers beating them and force-feeding them. When the news broke of the treatment received by these women, some of them elderly, outraged, the public put political pressure on President Wilson, who reversed his position, announcing his support for a suffrage amendment as a wartime measurement. In 1919, both the House and Senate passed the 19th Amendment. It was up to the states now. 3/4 of the states were needed for ratification, and as each state voted for the amendment, Paul and her colleagues sewed a star onto their suffrage flags. We hope you enjoyed the book and pattern reviews on our Civil War offerings at the Savage Quilter. April 12th, 2011, from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., the Savage Quilter will be having a Civil War commemoration. Please join us for a variety of fabrics, patterns, books, and information regarding Civil War quilting, and this lovely door prize will be available.